No show in American television history held its audience like The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. For 30 years it was more than just a nightly ritual, it was a mirror of the nation's mood, a barometer of culture, and above all a stage where legends were made and stories were told. At the center of it all was Johnny Carson, the poised Midwestern gentleman behind the mahogany desk, perfectly lit under the studio lights but emotionally shaded in ways the public could only guess at. Johnny Carson wasn't just a host, he was television's quiet conductor, orchestrating laughter, charm, awkward silences, and viral moments long before that term even existed. He was the master of timing, of the comedic pause, of letting a moment breathe. But what truly defined Carson wasn't just who he welcomed onto his stage, it was how he responded to those rare few who moved past his professional guard. Every night America saw Johnny smile, laugh, flatter, and improvise. But few ever saw the real Johnny, sharp, shy, reflective, and guarded about who he let into that inner sanctum behind the sparkling curtain. For someone who appeared in the homes of millions each evening, Johnny Carson remained by deliberate design a mystery. And yet, behind the scenes, away from the punchlines and applause signs, Carson's final exchanges with his most cherished guests pulled back the veil. Often unrecorded, passed from crew member to producer, these were not scripted setups or rehearsed punchlines. These were genuine, unscripted parting words, moments of vulnerability, spoken softly, sometimes backstage, sometimes just off camera. In their brevity, these words carried more weight than monologues or ratings. Because ultimately, they were rare glimpses into what Johnny valued most: timing, humility, authenticity, and connection. Not every celebrity made it into this quiet hall of Carson's respect. Of the more than 22,000 guests who joined him over his tenure, only a handful ever elicited something deeper, something more human. These were his chosen few. And tonight we reveal the words Johnny Carson reserved only for them. It starts, of all places, with a joke that wasn't meant to be one. Bob Hope was a legend. Long before Carson's name lit up the Tonight Show marquee, Hope was a king of vaudeville, a cinematic icon and America's comedic ambassador. When he came on the show, Carson treated him with public reverence. Introduced with flair, given ample couch time, and spoken of as a comedy pioneer, Hope was always treated like royalty. And yet the relationship between Carson and Hope was more nuanced than any television close-up revealed. Hope was ever prepared, cue cards in hand, jokes pre-written, meticulously timed. But that hyper-preparedness clashed with Carson's evolving style of conversational spontaneity. Privately, Johnny chafed at the rigidity, at how segments felt like performances, not exchanges. But never once did that private discomfort bleed into on-air interactions. Carson was a consummate professional. He never broke the drawn smile, never revealed the polite tightrope walk happening in real time. So, when Hope made his final appearance, the cameras caught only warmth. But backstage, as the applause still echoed, Carson walked up to him, looked him in the eye, and said with quiet sincerity, "Thanks for everything, Bob, you never missed ever." To the outside world, that may read like a polite sign-off. But to those who knew Johnny, those few words were a mountain of meaning. It wasn't about comedic chemistry, it wasn't about personal closeness, it was about respect, about acknowledging Hope's dependability, his enduring legacy, and his unshakable work ethic in a game where longevity counts more than trends. That was Johnny. He didn't shower you in praise. He didn't trade in compliments. He pinpointed the core truth and delivered it, rarely with flourish, but always with weight. If Hope represented the titan from whom Johnny inherited the keys to late night, then Dean Martin was something else entirely. Martin didn't carry legacy on his shoulders. He barely seemed to carry anything at all. He drifted onto the stage like a breeze smelled of cigars and bourbon, smirking his way through questions, occasionally missing chairs, deliberately forgetting punchlines. He was chaos wrapped in charm, and Carson loved it. With Martin, there was something different in Johnny's eyes, a lightness, an enjoyment that couldn't be faked. Carson, normally timing every beat of a conversation, eyes always clocking the producer, would lose track of time. He'd let segments breathe. He'd follow Martin's lead, not the other way around. At Martin's final appearance, Carson leaned in as the crowd clapped, shook his hand, and said something no scriptwriter had penned. Don't change Dano. The world needs at least one guy who never takes it seriously. And in that moment, a late-night icon told a fellow entertainer that nonchalance could be a form of grace, that the act of not taking everything so seriously was in a way the most serious gift of all. Where Dean Martin brought Johnny ease, George Burns commanded his curiosity. Burns wasn't just a guest, he was a bridge to a past Johnny. Studied with reverence, vaudeville, early radio, the beginnings of televised comedy, George had lived it all. For Carson, who had once pored over joke books in rural Nebraska, dreaming of standing under studio lights, Burns was more than a funny man. He was a professor of performance, a reminder that the roots of comedy mattered as much as the punchlines. Burns appeared on The Tonight Show well into his 90s, and unlike with most older guests, Carson never steered around his age. He leaned into it, not mockingly, but with admiration. During these appearances, Carson shifted gears. He wasn't the witty host cracking wise with the bandleader. He was a careful student, gently tossing setups that gave Burns room to shine. He'd let George be George, and in turn George let Johnny show his respect. On his final show with Burns, Johnny told him on camera, "You're the only guy I know who gets funnier every year." It played as a compliment, and it was. But behind the scenes the words he chose spoke loudly in silence. After the segment ended, and the band played its upbeat farewell, Carson pulled Burns aside, and reportedly said, "You make age feel like a punchline, and that's magic, George." To Carson, Burns wasn't just a living relic of comedy's golden roots, he was proof that evolution didn't mean forgetting your origins. That artistry could grow older and deeper, not outdated. And that's the thing about Carson. He was always aware of the changing tides. He didn't fear them, but he respected those who navigated them with grace. Then came Lucy. Lucille Ball, queen of the television sitcom, wasn't just respected by Carson, she was revered. When she entered the Tonight Show studio, cameras didn't just roll, history walked in. Ball had revolutionized the very format of TV comedy, and what bonded her to Carson was not just mutual respect, but shared weight. They didn't just perform for television, they had shaped it. When Lucy was on, Carson's demeanor was different, not controlled, not guarded, but honored. It wasn't deference in the uncomfortable sense, but rather a recognition of equals, colleagues, giants acknowledging each other in a room filled with fleeting stars. Backstage, it was reported that after Lucy's final visit, Johnny approached her quietly, almost somberly, and said, "You're the real deal, Lucy. Always were." 6 words. Not sprawling, not elaborate. But for someone as emotionally reserved as Johnny, those were sentiment-laden bricks laid on a foundation of respect. And later, when Ball passed away in 1989, Carson did something he rarely, almost never, did. He spoke openly on his show about what she had meant, not just to the landscape of sitcoms, or to television, but to him. He paused the laughter. He discarded performance. It wasn't a moment, it was personal, and you could feel it. In the cadence of his voice, in the absence of a joke, in the weight of a silence that for once, wasn't used for a laugh. The same hush washed over the studio in a very different way, when Jack Benny was a guest. Jack Benny wasn't just funny, he was a master of the unsaid, the pause, the stare. Benny understood, better than anyone, the comedic power of not speaking, and that more than anything, shaped Johnny Carson. Carson often spoke of Benny as a blueprint, the performer who taught him the geometry of timing. As Johnny once said in a rare interview, "Jack taught me that the space between the joke and the laugh can be the joke itself." That was Jack Benny's gift, and Carson never forgot it. When Benny made his final Tonight Show appearance, viewers saw Johnny lean in, his questions more open-ended, his gaze more fixed, his laughter more genuine, and less timed. After the lights dimmed that evening, Carson reportedly said something that crew never forgot. "You taught me how to listen." That was Carson's ultimate praise, not for showmanship, not for fame, but for listening. For understanding that comedy isn't just about lines, it's about life, silence, breathing, everything Jack Benny stood for. And in that private tribute, we see Carson's hierarchy, wit admired, legacy respected, but craftsmanship, above all else. It's a theme that would echo again when Burt Reynolds came on. With Burt, Carson let go of the format entirely. Water fights, shaving cream pranks, improvised chaos that had producers sweating yet delighted. Their chemistry was untouchable, not because it was rehearsed, but because neither tried to control it. Bert was the rare celebrity who didn't care about image. He didn't polish his lines, he showed up to play. After one particularly chaotic episode, Carson was said to have chuckled backstage and told Reynolds, "Keep coming back, I need someone to keep me honest." It wasn't just banter, it was a philosophy, because behind the smile and suit, Carson needed unrehearsed moments like oxygen. Reynolds gave him that. He reminded Carson and us that good television isn't about smooth lines, it's about real reactions. Where Reynolds brought out Carson's playful side, Carol Burnett brought a kind of joy that changed the mood of the entire studio. From the minute she walked onto the set, the air in the room seemed to shift. Her warmth wasn't feigned, her laughter wasn't polished for cameras. She radiated a sincerity not even the brightest spotlight could wash out. Carson, who never fully relinquished control of his segments, not to celebrity, not to circumstance, made an exception for Carol. When she was on, the stopwatch disappeared. The format loosened. Occasionally, Carson folded his arms and simply let her lead. He trusted her in the way pilots trust autopilot, knowing full well that she'd never let the plane crash. According to crew members, Carson would look at the schedule and say before taping, "Let Carol go as long as she wants. She never disappoints." And she didn't. Whether belting out a parody, riffing with Johnny, or turning 5 seconds of silence into pure gold, Carol Burnett wasn't just entertainment, she was light. After her final appearance during his tenure, Carson reportedly embraced her just off stage and said, "If I could build a whole show around one person, it would be you." Not a grand compliment, a quiet truth, and one that in retrospect cast Burnett as more than a guest. She was Carson's proof that kindness and intelligence could thrive under Klieg lights without needing self-promotion as a lubricant. Burnett brought out the collaborator in Johnny. She didn't push for control, she invited play. He didn't protect his image around her, he just relaxed into being a performer again, a juggler no longer counting the balls, just tossing them in rhythm. That rhythm became almost hypnotic during Johnny's exchanges with Bob Newhart. If Dean Martin was the guest who made Johnny laugh out loud, and Carol Burnett let him forget he was working, then Bob Newhart was the one who mirrored him. Where others turned performance into projection, Newhart made everything smaller, quieter, more precise. His comedy was made of pauses, of hesitation, of the recognition that something funny is more powerful when the audience discovers it in silence, rather than being handed it on a platter. Carson admired that. It wasn't just comedy, it was craftsmanship. In their interviews there was no competition, no ego, just two men with matching comedic frequency. They didn't have to lean in to land a laugh, a blink, a beat, a raised eyebrow. That was the dance, each one giving the other room. One Tonight Show writer once said, "Watching Johnny and Bob was like two acoustic guitars playing the same melody, without looking at each other, just perfect sync." Backstage after their final segment together, Carson reportedly clasped Bob's shoulder and said with a smile, "Nobody made it look easier, and I know exactly how hard that is." For Carson that was the highest form of praise, because Johnny knew more than the audience ever would, that the moments that looked effortless were the ones most carefully carved. That mutual respect didn't need testimonials, it just needed a shared glance, a chuckle, a pause. But if Newhart was a mirror to Johnny's style, Jimmy Stewart was a mirror to Johnny's heart. Their connection came not from timing, performance, or comedy, but from something far more human, grief. In one of television's most unforgettable moments, in 1981, Jimmy Stewart sat beside Carson and quietly said he'd written a poem, not a bit, not a promo, a poem. And when he started reading lines about his beloved golden retriever, no one in the crowd was ready for what followed, including Carson. As Stewart described Bo's rituals, quirks and eventual death, the studio fell silent. Carson, the man who filled silences for a living, sat in stillness. And when Stewart's voice cracked, Carson's eyes welled up. He reached across the desk and said only, "Thank you for sharing that, Jimmy." No punchline, no pivot, no reset to show mode. In a career made of careful distance, Johnny let go of the reins. Backstage, according to staff who were there, Carson later told Stewart in a hushed moment, "I'll never forget that. You just gave us something real." Coming from Carson, that wasn't just sentiment, it was a crack in the shell, an acknowledgement of vulnerability, both Stewart's and his own. After that night, Carson's relationship with emotion on stage shifted, even if subtly. He never became openly sentimental. He didn't cry weekly on late night, but he allowed for moments of honesty, for silence, for the kind of realness that couldn't be prepped in the dressing room. And above all, Stewart showed him, and us, that audience connection didn't always come with applause. Sometimes it came in the quiet. The kind of quiet Carson had always filled with jokes, now finding its own kind of gravity. It's here, in this spectrum, from Hope's polish to Stewart's rawness, that Carson's true values emerge. He didn't rank guests by fame, he ranked them by feeling. Did they make him feel something real? Did they strip the varnish off performance and reveal the person underneath? Because for Johnny Carson, the best guests weren't just interviews, they were reminders. Reminders that even behind the desk, you could connect without pretending. As Carson's show rolled on through the decades, through changing political winds, new pop stars, cultural upheavals, and evolving comedy styles, what never changed was Johnny's careful firewall between who he was on stage and who he was behind the curtain. To most viewers, Carson was the same every night, sharp, polished, gently biting with humor that never pierced too deep. He was someone you could laugh with before heading to bed, a voice that smoothed the edges of life's chaos. But to those few who made it behind the performance, there was another Johnny entirely, quiet, observant, emotional in bursts, and quite possibly lonely at times in the very spotlight that made him a national fixture. This contrast between host and human became clearest in those off-camera exchanges with his favorite guests, because it wasn't performative laughter or crafted words that stayed with those colleagues. It was what he chose to say when no one else was supposed to be listening, and in many ways, that's where his legacy lives. Not only in the ratings, or the celebrity, or even the game-changing influence, but in the understated acknowledgments, quietly handed off like secrets. Johnny didn't gush, he didn't flatter. He selected his comments the same way he selected the beats in a monologue, with ruthless precision and meaning. To understand what Carson held sacred, you only have to look at who he acknowledged, and how. Take Don Rickles, for instance. Their exchanges were often barbed, hilarious, and filled with biting jabs that made audiences roar. But beneath the antics, beneath the roast-style banter, Rickles was one of the very few who made Johnny laugh hard, uncontrollably. Rickles didn't just mock Carson on his own turf, he disarmed him, and that delighted Johnny. After a segment where Rickles went on a particularly unfiltered tirade, leaving Carson visibly cracking up, Johnny reportedly told him backstage, "You insulted me better than anyone else ever could, and that's the highest compliment I can give." It was, uniquely, the Carson version of love, trusting someone enough to make you the target. Then there was Robin Williams, the storm of unpredictability, where most guests followed an understood rhythm, setup, punchline, anecdote, applause. Williams charged through the studio like a lightning bolt. Carson, who typically anchored the energy, would fall back and observe, laughing, pointing, wide-eyed, not just entertained, but awed. He once joked, "I don't even need to be here when Robin comes on, I should just take the night off." But behind that wisecrack was the truth. Johnny loved performers who could tap into chaos and wrestle it into comedy. That was a magic he respected, because it's a magic you can't fake. Years later, when reflecting privately with a friend, it's said that Johnny remarked, "Robin didn't just visit the show, he hijacked it, and every time, I was happy to hand him the keys." That kind of surrender, rare from Carson, and revealing, because performance, for Carson, was control. That's what made his final episode so powerful. For years Carson had been the man who introduced people, who guided the spotlight, who directed traffic on the national freeway of fame. And then suddenly, the stage was his alone, for the very last time. No guest to banter with, no applause cues to follow, just Johnny, the desk, and a country holding its breath. He could have ended with a joke, a punchline, a banner headline of laughter, but instead he chose something else. "I bid you a very heartfelt good night." No spectacle, no gimmick, just sincerity. And after the cameras stopped rolling that night, Johnny Carson, the comedian, the television icon, the face millions had watched for 3 decades, walked off the stage, exited the building, and as legend goes, never returned to television again. No victory parade, no post-show deals, just a curtain, and then a life behind it. That quiet exit said more about the man than any retrospective ever could. Because underneath all the timing and talent, all the razzle and charm, Carson was, as those closest to him would later confirm, a man desperately in love with the art of it all, but uneasy with the fame that followed. He respected people who worked on their craft without waving it around. He admired subtlety, timing, listening. He wasn't seduced by status. He was moved by effortlessness, by authenticity, by truth, disguised as comedy. Perhaps that's why his most meaningful words weren't broadcast. They were whispered, off camera, backstage, in dressing rooms and corridors, shared through memory, not microphone. To George Burns, "You make age feel like a punchline, and that's magic." To Dean Martin, "Don't change, Dino. The world needs at least one guy who never takes it seriously." To Jimmy Stewart, "You just gave us something real." Each of those moments is a window into what Carson valued when showtime was over. Not ratings, not clout, but genuine connection, reflection, a sense that something had mattered beyond the laugh. That in the end was Carson's quiet rebellion against the machine of celebrity. He didn't need the show to be unforgettable. He just needed the moment, stripped of artifice, soaked in sincerity. It's why we still talk about him. Johnny Carson never needed to say much to leave a mark. In fact, that was part of his legend. He knew when not to speak, when to let a smile linger, when to breathe through a moment rather than drown it in noise. In a television world, fueled by volume, Carson's superpower was restraint. And that gift, knowing the difference between saying something and saying something that matters, was never clearer than in his final words, to the people he respected most. It wasn't about goodbye, not really. Johnny didn't do grand farewells. There were no over-the-top send-offs or teary countdowns when a guest came for the final time. But there were these subtle, lasting acknowledgments, words that seemed insignificant to an outsider, but to those who understood him, they were profound. Because if Carson gave you a quiet nod, a few well-chosen words, you'd been seen. Think of it like jazz, not the notes, but the not, 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 spaces between them. That's where the magic lived. Benny Stewart, Newhart, Burnett, these weren't just celebrities to Johnny. They were fellow craftsmen, people who understood the grind, the preparation, the relentless, invisible discipline behind effortless delivery. They didn't just get on stage and perform. They knew what it took to make it look easy. And that's what Carson admired more than anything, effort made invisible. He once reportedly told a producer, "I like people who polish till the scratches disappear, and never point at the shine." Anyone could rehearse a laugh, but not everyone could make you feel it. Take Steve Martin, for example, one of comedy's most cerebral minds. Steve brought a strange absurdist energy to his appearances, an unpredictable twist on traditional showmanship. Whether letting balloons loose on set, performing impromptu magic, or diving into surreal bits mid-interview, Martin pushed boundaries in ways that Carson didn't emulate, but deeply appreciated. Because beneath the absurdity was precision, always. After one particularly avant-garde bit that left the audience puzzled and roaring at the same time, Carson is said to have leaned over during a commercial break and told Steve, "You make weird look necessary." 5 words. But for Carson, a cathedral of a compliment. He respected anyone willing to challenge comfort in pursuit of clarity. That same appreciation extended to women as well, though fewer female comics were elevated during Carson's heyday. Those who broke through did so not only with talent, but with self-possession, and when they did, Johnny noticed. Joan Rivers was one such case, though their relationship would end painfully after Rivers launched her own competing show. Before that rift, Carson had been her greatest champion, calling her a singular force of perspective and performance. During her early appearances, he gave her not space, not just center stage, and for Carson, that meant a great deal. Recognition wasn't just offered, it was earned. The manner of his tribute changed person to person, but the pattern, once you see it, is unmistakable.
He didn't reward fame, he acknowledged truth. Truth in timing, truth in tone, truth in tone, truth in the person navigating the moment. And what knit all his favorite guests together wasn't just their talent, it was vulnerability masquerading as confidence. That's what Carson himself mastered. He looked calm, controlled, measured, but inside, he was constantly negotiating the storm of emotions that came from bearing part of yourself while protecting the rest. Those who got Johnny didn't try to pry it out. They met him there, in that middle ground, and when they did, he gave them something rare in return. Honesty. Not the tabloid kind, not the performative brand of access built for branding and algorithms. No, the quiet kind. The kind you only get from people who are willing to break character, even if only behind the curtain.